talking about the evolutionary significance, if glycolysis occurs in almost all organisms, then it most likely was the first process involved in any organism that needed to utilize glucose or any other sugar source and produce adenosine triphosphate. So it probably evolved in ancient prokaryotes before there was oxygen in the atmosphere. Okay. And glycolysis and the citric acid cycle both collectively can be used for many catabolic and anabolic pathways. And catabolic pathways, okay, so metabolism is where we're breaking things down. They're going to funnel electrons from different organic compounds and use those in cellular respiration. Okay. Glycolysis doesn't just use glucose, as you found. We can also use fructose when we hydrolyze sucrose. And proteins can be broken down as well and actually use those to feed glycolysis or the citric acid cycle. So really what we're doing is we're breaking things down to make energy, and this is actually what you see as well. Now, fatty acids can be digested, but the catch here is, remember I told you that breaking down fats is actually going to require a lot of energy. Okay? So if we take fatty acids and break them down via beta oxidation to yield acetyl-CoA, that's going to take a lot of energy. So these two events here, where we utilize carbohydrates and we utilize proteins, are much more likely to occur with little energy than breaking down fats or fatty acids. But the payoff is that if we actually oxidize a gram of fat, it's going to produce twice as much ATP as an oxidized gram of carbohydrates. It's just that it requires so much energy to break those bonds that unless we absolutely produce a situation in our body where that's required, our body won't do it.
So it's better
In terms of consumption, well, they're both good for you.
it's better. It's better for the body.
Well, a healthy and balanced diet is really the key to anything. I'm not saying you should go out and just sit and eat lard and then go running, okay? I'm also not saying you should just consume a carb diet that's exclusive. That's not good either. Ideally, as I've said before, what you really should do is limit your calories to an appropriate amount, not like 500, but like if you're exercising, about 1,500 to 2,500, depending upon how much you're exercising. Make sure you're actually eating the right kinds of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, and then exercise for between 30 minutes to an hour and a half a day. Okay? That's going to start to reduce the amount of carbohydrates you have in your system. You're going to use up all the glycogen that you're using in storage in your liver, and then your body's going to start to break down some of the excess fat if you have some of the excess fat. It's also going to help you tone your body. It's going to make you much healthier. If you instead just go the dieting route without exercise, what actually usually winds up happening is you will trim down, but it's not actually fat that you're trimming off so much as muscle mass. And muscle cells are very, very, very abundant in both proteins and carbohydrates, and they're a lot easier to break down than fat cells are.
Wait, what's that? What is in the meaning? What causes that to happen?
If you just diet but don't exercise, you will lose weight, but it's not the kind of weight you're probably really wanting to lose.
That's what you can do back to that.
Exactly. Well, that, and also a lot of people when they diet, they actually, because they starve themselves for several meals and then they eat. And your brain's divided into 3 sections. One of those sections is the reptilian brain that adjusts appropriately, kind of like reptiles' brains do. And it doesn't understand that when you are not eating, that you're going to eat eventually. So what it actively does is if you starve yourself the first 2 meals of the day, and then you eat that 3rd meal, it treats it as though that's the only meal you're going to get for a while, and stores it typically as fat, because it thinks that you're starving, and it wants to save that energy, protect your vital organs, and potentially provide you with a fail-safe source of energy that's stored for a long period of time.
That's why you should be healthy snacks.
Exactly. That's why it's actually better to snack throughout the day than to just eat 3 meals. Okay, but this is showing you how everything is kind of tied together. Okay, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Okay, and how they can be used to fuel these different stages at any given point in time. Okay? And this also can help us produce anabolic or I guess produce larger molecules through anabolic pathways. Okay, so small molecules can come from glycolysis or the citric acid cycle, and they can actively be used to build larger ones. So really what we're seeing is we're seeing this super large pathway that can help us make larger molecules from smaller molecules and smaller molecules from larger molecules. Furthermore, since we're working with ATP and we're actively phosphorylating, dephosphorylating, producing more ATP, producing less ATP, we're going to use feedback inhibition, just like we've seen before, to regulate this process, because we don't want to produce an excess amount of ATP if we don't absolutely have to use it. Because remember, that ATP exists in a state that is spontaneous, which means it's going to release its energy. And if you make too much of it, you don't need to utilize that energy. You're basically wasting energy. So here's what happens. As you perform these processes and you produce adenosine triphosphate, if you produce it in a large enough amount, it's going to actually inhibit phosphofructokinase, which is one of the enzymes involved extensively in glycolysis. Okay? That phosphofructokinase being blocked means you're not going to make any more ATP. As this ATP is used up, your phosphofructokinase can also become activated. Additionally, you can activate phosphofructokinase with an excessive amount of AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. If you have too much of that, that basically is activating this enzyme, telling it we need to make more ATP. Additionally, if you carry out the citric acid cycle way too much, you're going to produce an excess of citrate, which is also going to inhibit phosphofructokinase. So there's this delicate balance that allows us to make just the right amount of energy depending upon how much we need. So we don't squander any, and we don't actively make an excessive amount of ATP that we won't be able to utilize. Questions? Okay. I've been thinking about it as I've been talking, and I think what I do want to do is use what the new book is saying. I'd like to give you all a range, but I'm too afraid it's going to become incredibly confusing. Who here, just show of hands, has the new book? Who here has the old book? Okay. For those of you who have the old book, I want you to write right now what I'm going to write on the board. If I'm not mistaken, the new book is 26 to 28 in oxidative phosphorylation, correct? Okay. So, what you're going to need to write is for glycolysis. This should already be in your book. You're going to make 2 net ATP. For the citric acid cycle, it's going to be 2 ATP. And then for oxidative phosphorylation, it's going to be 26 to 28 ATP that produces, giving us a grand total of between 30 to 32 ATP produced for all the processes involved. I apologize profusely for the mix-up. I will go home and correct it now so that it's not an issue in the future, but I do apologize if that made it into my lecture and caused any confusion. Because, you know, it wasn't like this was already a confusing lecture to begin with. But let's use the new book and the information in that. So those of you who have the old book, go ahead and change it now. Because I figure also, you're probably just going to be seeing this all over the place in mastering biology, and I would hate for you to get set on one and be saying, oh, we're going to do the other as well. Okay, so questions, concerns, anything else you'd like me to talk about in regards to cellular respiration? Okay, let's go ahead and start photosynthesis. Okay, so before we even get into the definitions and all that fun stuff, let's do what I always like to do, which is break the word down. Okay, so anytime you see SIS at the end of the word, it means the process of. Okay? To synthesize something, to make or create. And the prefix photo means light. So this literally translates to the process of making something using light. Again, it literally translates to the process of making something using light. So in cellular respiration, we saw glucose being broken down into pyruvate, and in the process of that, we were generating these products that would be used in the electron transport chain. And we were ultimately making adenosine triphosphate. So let me go ahead real quick. I'm just going to write the overall equation for respiration up on the board, and then I'm going to write the overall equation for photosynthesis. I'm going to let you tell me if you see anything that looks kind of funny or fishy or anything like that. So for respiration, our equation looked like this. For photosynthesis, our equation is going to look like this. Okay? Tell me what you see. What do you notice about these two? They're the inverse of each other, right? So, plants utilize the energy in light to generate chemical energy in the form of glucose. And either plants can then use that glucose along with the oxygen to fuel cellular respiration, or plants can be consumed by another organism that will utilize that glucose and that oxygen to perform cellular respiration. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's do the part I know y'all always love doing. Help me identify what's being oxidized and what's being reduced. Okay, so I'm going from carbon dioxide to glucose. Okay, so that's being reduced. And then we're going from water to oxygen. Oxidized. Does anybody still have questions about that? Okay. Now let's take it a step farther. Which of the two reactants is the reducing agent? Carbon dioxide or water? Water. This is the reducing agent. The reducing agent gets oxidized, which would make carbon dioxide the what? The oxidizing agent. Good. That is going to be on the exam, guys, so please make sure you know it. Email me or come and see me if you don't. Try to do it before Monday, because I think I'm going to be sick on Monday. Okay. I have a sneaking suspicion that I might be sick on Monday. We'll see. I've said that before and still. Okay, so that's the basis of what we're doing in photosynthesis. Now the fun part, now that we've got the easy stuff out of the way, I get to show you all the hard stuff.